3:00 a.m. Paris. Blue lights flash on the ring road. One of the highest-paid footballers on the planet is in handcuffs. With a €12 million salary, Marco Verratti had everything money could buy, except discipline. Why did the little Pirlo end up exiled in the Qatari desert at just 30 years old? Today, Fallen Legends exposes the secret habit and the agonizing pain-killing injections that turned a generational genius into a modern tragedy. The date was October 30th, 2018. The city was Paris, a metropolis that sleeps in shifts where the glamour of the day often gives way to the reckless hedonism of the night. It was just past 3:00 a.m. on the Boulevard Périphérique, the ring road that encircles the heart of the capital. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional taxi and the rhythmic flash of street lamps passing overhead. But then the silence was broken by the sharp, piercing wail of a siren. Blue lights bounced off the asphalt, illuminating the sleek, dark curves of a luxury SUV. When the French police officers approached the vehicle window, they likely expected a standard procedure. A late-night reveler, perhaps a businessman returning from a long dinner. But as the window rolled down, they didn't find a businessman. They found the Prince of the Parc des Princes. They found Marco Verratti. To the football world, Verratti was a deity. He was the little owl, the midfield maestro who could conduct a symphony with his feet. On the pitch, he was defined by his impossible calmness. He could receive the ball inside his own penalty box, surrounded by 3 defenders, and pirouette his way out of trouble without his heart rate rising above resting. He was the embodiment of control. But on that cold October night, sitting in the driver's seat, Marco Verratti had lost all control. The officers administered a breathalyzer test. The results were damning. The device registered a blood alcohol level of 0.49 mgl. For a probationary driver, which Verratti technically was at the time, this wasn't just over the line. It was more than double the legal limit allowed by French law. In that singular moment, the veil of the elite athlete was torn away. The man behind the wheel wasn't the disciplined professional paid millions to maintain peak physical condition. He was just another young, wealthy man who believed he was invincible, reckless enough to endanger himself and others after a night of heavy drinking. The news broke the next morning with the force of a scandal. L'Équipe, the Bible of French sports journalism, splashed the story across its pages. The headline wasn't about a sublime assist or a tactical masterclass. It was a mugshot of failure. For Paris Saint-Germain, a club obsessed with its public image and desperate to be taken seriously as a European giant, this was a nightmare. The club's response was swift, corporate, and ultimately revealing. They didn't suspend him. They didn't bench him for the season. Instead, they hit him where it was supposed to hurt his wallet. PSG announced they would be withholding a portion of his ethical bonus, a clause inserted into modern contracts specifically to prevent this kind of embarrassment. The fine was estimated to be around €150,000, 150,000 euros. To the average fan sitting in the stands, that number is life-changing. It is a house. It is a decade of savings. It is security. But in the distorted reality of Marco Verratti's life, where the Qatari ownership deposited millions into his account every year, €150,000 was a drop in the ocean. It was the equivalent of a parking ticket. And this is where the true tragedy of the incident lies. It wasn't just a traffic violation. It was a symptom of a much deeper rot within the culture of the club and the player himself. Verratti paid the fine, issued a hollow apology, and was back in the starting lineup almost immediately. The message was clear: talent excuses behavior. Money fixes mistakes. But money cannot fix a liver, and it cannot repair a reputation. That night on the ring road proved what critics had whispered for years, that Marco Verratti was a part-time professional in a full-time sport. While legends like Cristiano Ronaldo were asleep recovering for the next battle, Verratti was out in the Paris night burning the candle at both ends. He thought he was living the dream, but in reality he was driving his career off a cliff one drink at a time. To fully grasp the magnitude of Marco Verratti's wasted potential, we first have to understand the era he was playing in. The 2010s were the decade of the super athlete. Football had evolved. It was no longer the days of George Best or Paul Gascoigne, where a pint of lager before a match was part of the culture. This was the age of Cristiano Ronaldo. It was an era of hyper-optimization where players slept in hyperbaric oxygen chambers, hired private chefs to weigh their broccoli, and treated their bodies like Formula One engines. In this landscape of biological machines, Marco Verratti was a glitch. He was a ghost from a bygone era, a throwback to the 1980s. Hedonist accidentally dropped into the high-pressing, high-octane world of modern Champions League football. While his peers were obsessing over recovery shakes and ice baths, Marco Verratti was doing something that seems almost inconceivable for a central midfielder in the 21st century. He was smoking. This wasn't a rumor whispered in dark corners. It was an open secret practically flaunted under the noses of the Parisian elite. Every summer, the paparazzi photos would emerge from the beaches of Ibiza or Formentera. There was Marco relaxed on a yacht, a glass of wine in one hand and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't hide it. In fact, he seemed to revel in the rebellion of it. For a goalkeeper, perhaps this vice could be forgiven, but Verratti was a midfielder. His job description was to run. He was the engine room of Paris Saint-Germain, tasked with covering 12 kilometers a game, pressing opponents, and dictating the tempo. How does a man perform at an elite level when his lungs are coated in tar? The answer lies in his terrifying God-given talent. And this is where the testimony of those closest to him becomes both awe-inspiring and infuriating. Thomas Meunier, the Belgian defender who shared a dressing room with Verratti at PSG, gave an interview that pulled back the curtain on this paradox. He described a player who defied all logic. In the parties, Verratti was always the one with a glass in his hand, the one smoking, Meunier recalled, shaking his head in disbelief. But then on the pitch, he was still the best. It was crazy. He didn't need to train like us. He just played. It sounds like a compliment, doesn't it? It sounds like the myth of a genius. But dig a little deeper and you find the tragedy. The magic allowed Verratti to dominate in Ligue 1. In the domestic French league, where the pace was slower and the opposition weaker, his technical brilliance was enough. He could smoke a pack a day and still spin circles around defenders from Dijon or Metz. He could play at 70% capacity and still be the best player on the park. But the Champions League is a different beast. The Champions League is the truth teller. When PSG faced the juggernauts of Europe, Bayern Munich, Manchester City, Real Madrid, talent wasn't enough. You needed stamina. You needed lungs of steel to cope with the relentless, suffocating press of a Pep Guardiola or Jurgen Klopp team. And this is where the secret habit caught up with Marco Verratti. Watch the tapes of those big European nights. There is a pattern as predictable as the setting sun. Verratti would start the game looking like the best midfielder in the world. He would control the ball-evade tackles and dictate play, but then the clock would tick past the 60-minute mark. While players like Luka Modric, who is nearly a decade older than Verratti, were just getting warmed up, Verratti would begin to fade. His face would flush red. His hands would go to his hips. He would be gasping for air, his chest heaving as his compromised cardiovascular system struggled to oxygenate his muscles. Inevitably, the fourth official's board would go up. Number 6, substituted, usually between the 60th and 70th minute. He became known as the 60-minute man. In the decisive moments of the biggest games, when legends are made in the dying minutes of extra time, Marco Verratti was usually sitting on the bench wrapped in a jacket watching his team collapse. Julien Laurent, one of the most respected French football journalists, summed it up with a quote that should haunt every fan who loved watching Verratti play. Speaking on BBC 5 Live, Laurens didn't hold back. "Verratti smokes, he drinks, he goes out," Laurens said. "If he had the lifestyle of Cristiano Ronaldo, I truly believe he would have been the greatest midfielder in history. Better than Xavi, better than Iniesta." Read that again. Better than Xavi, better than Iniesta. That is the cost of the habit. We aren't talking about a good player who failed to become great. We are talking about a player who had the potential to be the GOAT, greatest of all time in his position, but who chose the immediate pleasure of a cigarette over the eternal glory of a legacy. This lifestyle didn't just affect his stamina, it affected his durability. You cannot poison your body and expect it to heal. Verratti missed over 100 games for PSG due to various injuries. His body was constantly in a state of inflammation, unable to recover from the knocks and bruises of the game because his immune system was fighting a war on two fronts: the trauma of football and the toxicity of his lifestyle. The world looked at Verratti and saw a magician, but the cold hard data saw a wasted asset. A player earning 12 million euros a year, that's 1 million euros a month, who was physically incapable of finishing a high-intensity match. PSG was paying a fortune for a Ferrari, but they were letting the driver fill the tank with cheap diesel. Ultimately, Verratti's habit wasn't just a personal choice, it was a professional insult to the game. Every time he lit up, he was burning a small piece of his own greatness. And while he laughed in the photos from Ibiza surrounded by smoke and friends, the history books were slowly closing the chapter on him, moving him from the list of legends to the list of what could have been. The smoke didn't just cloud his lungs, it clouded his legacy. It is easy to look at the photos of Marco Verratti with a cigarette in his hand and label him. It is easy to call him unprofessional, lazy, or spoiled. But before we cast the final stone, we need to look at the X-rays. We need to understand the brutal, silent reality of his existence inside the locker room. Marco Verratti stands at just 1.65 meters tall. In the modern game, he is a minnow swimming in a tank of sharks. For over a decade, his job was to hold on to the ball while 90-kilogram defenders tried to break him. He took the hits, he absorbed the tackles, he put his tiny frame on the line against the physical monsters of Europe. and while his mind was quick enough to dodge the pressure, his body eventually paid the tax. There is a specific medical term that haunted Verratti's career, a word that strikes fear into the heart of any professional athlete: chronic pubalgia. It is a groin injury, but that description is too mild. Pubalgia is a searing, tearing pain in the core of the body. It feels like a knife twisting in your pelvis every time you sprint, every time you turn, every time you kick a ball. It is an injury that doesn't just hurt, it debilitates. It keeps you awake at night. It makes simple movements like getting out of a car and exercise in agony. In 2016, this pain reached a breaking point. Verratti was forced to undergo surgery, a decision that cost him his place at Euro 2016 with Italy. In a tearful press conference, the world saw a different side of the party boy. We saw a young man devastated that his body had failed him. He didn't want to be on a yacht. He wanted to be on the pitch. But here is where the story gets darker. Here is where the millions of euros turn into blood money. Donato Di Campi, Verratti's former agent, once dropped a bombshell revelation that the media largely ignored. He revealed that for years, Marco didn't just play through the pain, he was chemically silenced. To get through big matches for PSG, to justify that massive salary, Verratti would frequently take pain-killing injections. Imagine the cycle. You are in agony. The doctors stick a needle into your groin to numb the nerves. You play 90 minutes of high-intensity football, your body taking trauma that you cannot feel because of the drugs. Then the final whistle blows. The adrenaline fades, the anesthetic wears off, and the pain returns 10 times worse than before. This brings us back to the secret habit. Why did Marco Verratti smoke? Why did he drink? Perhaps it wasn't just because he loved the taste of tobacco or the buzz of alcohol. Psychologists who work with elite athletes often speak of coping mechanisms. When you are living in a cycle of chronic pain and extreme pressure, you look for a release. You look for something, anything, to bring the nervous system down. The cigarette wasn't just a sign of rebellion, it was a sedative. The alcohol wasn't just for the party, it was a numbing agent. We look at Verratti and see a hedonist, but maybe, just maybe, we are looking at a man who was self-medicating. He was trapped in a golden cage where he was paid to perform regardless of the physical cost. He gave PSG his limbs, his joints, and his health. In return, they gave him money and looked the other way when he lit up a cigarette to calm his shaking hands. There is a profound loneliness in chronic pain. You can be surrounded by teammates, you can be cheered by thousands, but inside your own skin, you are screaming. The partying lifestyle that the tabloids criticized might have been Verratti's frantic attempt to escape that loneliness, to feel alive and normal in a body that felt broken. So when we talk about the secret habit that stopped him from becoming a legend, we have to acknowledge the nuance. The smoke didn't just ruin his lungs, it likely saved his sanity. It was the crutch he leaned on when his legs could no longer support the weight of expectation. He sacrificed his physical integrity for the badge. He took the injections. He played until he couldn't walk. And in the dark, quiet hours after the game, when the pain was screaming, he reached for the only things that offered silence. We called him unprofessional, but perhaps he was just a human being in pain, trying to survive in a machine that demanded he be a god. If the physical pain was the cage that confined Marco Verratti, then Paris Saint-Germain was the lock. By the summer of 2017, Verratti was standing at the most critical crossroads of his career. He was 24 years old. He had conquered France multiple times, but the holy grail, the Champions League, remained agonizingly out of reach. And then the call came. It was the call every midfielder of his generation dreamed of: FC Barcelona. The Spanish giants looked at Verratti and saw a mirror image of their own philosophy. Xavi Hernandez had just left and Andres Iniesta was aging. Barcelona didn't just want Verratti, they needed him. They saw him as the rightful heir to the throne of tiki-taka. For Marco, this was his destiny. It was a chance to leave the comfort zone of League One to play alongside Lionel Messi and to finally test himself against the very best in an environment that demanded absolute perfection. He wanted to go. The desire was so strong that he did something uncharacteristic. He rebelled. He posed for a photo with the Spanish newspaper Mundo Deportivo, holding the front page that announced his transfer. It was a public declaration of war against PSG. But Marco Verratti forgot who he was dealing with. He wasn't dealing with a football club. He was dealing with a nation-state. The reaction from Nasser Al-Khelaifi, the president of PSG, was not one of negotiation. It was one of fury. To the Qatari ownership, selling their best player to a European rival wasn't a business transaction. It was a humiliation. They viewed Verratti not as an employee with rights, but as a crown jewel in their soft power empire. It was during this tense standoff that Donato Di Campi, Verratti's longtime agent and the man who had guided his career since he was a teenager, dropped a quote that would go down in football history. In an interview with Corriere dello Sport, Di Campi ripped away the veneer of luxury surrounding the club. "Marco is a prisoner of the Emir," Di Campi declared. He lives in a golden cage? It was a shocking choice of words, but it was the truth. De Campley was trying to save his client. He was trying to break the bars of the cage. He knew that if Marco stayed in Paris where he was pampered, protected, and paid a fortune, he would never reach his full potential. He knew that Marco needed the discipline of Barcelona to become a legend. But the system fought back, and it fought dirty. PSG threatened legal action. They applied crushing pressure on the young Italian, and Verratti, lacking the steely resolve to fight a geopolitical entity, folded. He didn't just stay, he capitulated completely. In a video released on the club's social media channels, a video that looked disturbingly like a hostage reading a prepared statement, Verratti apologized to the club and the fans. He threw his agent under the bus. Within days, he fired De Campley, the man who had spoken the truth, and hired Mino Raiola. The message was clear, the rebellion was over, the establishment had won. And then came the golden handcuffs. To ensure Verratti never thought about leaving again, PSG opened the vault. They handed him a new contract worth a staggering 12 million euros a year. 12 million euros, that is 1 million euros a month. It was a bribe. It was hush money paid to kill his ambition. By accepting that contract, Verratti effectively signed away his legacy. He chose the money over the glory. He chose the lifestyle of Paris, where he was treated like a god, where his smoking was tolerated, where his lateness was forgiven over the rigorous demands of Catalonia. If he had gone to Barcelona, the culture would have forced him to change. You cannot smoke a pack a day and play in a midfield with Sergio Busquets and Lionel Messi. The peer pressure alone would have forced him to evolve. But in Paris, surrounded by enablers who threw money at his problems, Verratti was allowed to remain a child. The golden cage that De Campley warned us about became Verratti's permanent residence. He became the face of PSG's domestic dominance and their European failure. He was the king of the French league, a big fish in a small pond collecting checks, while the true legends of the game, Modric, Kroos, De Bruyne, were collecting Champions League trophies. The tragedy of 2017 wasn't just a failed transfer. It was the death of Marco Verratti, the legend. From that moment on, he was simply Marco Verratti, the employee. He stayed in the cage because it was comfortable and because the bars were made of solid gold. But as he would eventually find out, even gold cannot buy back the years you wasted standing still. Wasted standing still. Wasted standing still.